Okay, jobs and job skills. Another quiz question. The best anti-poverty program is a good job. Talk about that one at your table for just a minute. Okay, let's start with true. How many tables came up with true for that? And how many people came up with false for that? Well, I'm surprised. We have a split, the jury is split on this one. I'll go with Mayor Coleman started out with a quote that was very similar to this, and this is what the data suggests. They could be debated in a number of different ways. Maybe the best is pushing it a little bit, but let me show you what the data about this say. So here in St. Paul, if you split people into groups where, if you look at everybody who worked full-time year-round, then you look at people who work either part-time or only part of the year, and then if you looked at people who did not work at all, you can see that the poverty rates are just dramatically different. If you had a full-time job, it does not guarantee that you're making enough money to have a cushy lifestyle, but on the other hand, very few of those people who are working full-time year-round are under that poverty threshold. So obviously jobs need to be a big part of this Opportunity St. Paul initiative. This is many people say that we're out of the recession. Well, for St. Paul, that's really not true. This is a really hard time to sort of cure poverty through jobs. This is the trend line of jobs in St. Paul up through, I think it's the second quarter in 2011. That, in many places that line has started to come back out, but we had at the beginning of the decade, there were actually more jobs in St. Paul. This isn't people, this is just jobs that are out there. Than we do now in 2011. There's been a downward trend line. If we want to compare this to elsewhere, just to give you a perspective, we'll put it in percentage terms. So over the decade, we lost about 13% of the jobs within the St. Paul city boundaries. The Twin Cities, it's gone up and down over the decade, and we're still recovering, but at least that trend line is heading back up. And there is some comfort here. Actually, only 1/3 of St. Paul residents work within the city boundaries, so we need to pay attention to job opportunities outside the city boundaries as well. But it is particularly hard here in St. Paul. And just for reference, I added what the job changes look like over the past decade for the U.S. So we have our work cut out for us in terms of those job opportunities here and the equation and how that plays into the whole equation. This slide, this is for Minnesota as a whole, and it does illustrate some things that not only have we lost jobs over the decade, but there's been some churn in the types of jobs that are out there. So this is actually ordered from the biggest sectors in the whole state to the smallest employment sectors in the whole state, or out of these top 10 or 12. It's ordered from biggest to lowest, but you can see that the biggest sector is healthcare or social assistance, and that sector has actually grown quite a bit. And there are some jobs that don't require a lot of education in healthcare, but on the other hand, there are a lot of jobs that require a lot of education. There's sort of not only has the number of jobs changed, but the types of jobs, the types of skills that are needed to get these jobs have kind of changed. Manufacturing, a lot of people talk about, and in Minnesota we've lost about 1/4 manufacturing job. A lot of people talk about construction as well, and we've lost about 1/4 of all construction jobs. And so those jobs that might not have required years and years of education, but still paid pretty decent wages, we've lost a lot of those jobs, and a different skill set is being required by the jobs that are now available. So, and on top of that, Not everyone has equal access to the available jobs. About a year or year and a half ago, the Economic Policy Institute came out with a study that compared unemployment rates by race, and it showed that the Twin Cities had the biggest gap between white unemployment rates and the employment rates of African Americans in particular, that was the biggest gap in the nation, or maybe the second biggest gap, depending on how you look at it, but way too big of a gap either way. And when you look at the data for St. Paul, unfortunately, this is just people living in St. Paul, that we see the gap here in the city as well. So that's something that we need to pay attention to as well. It's not just race. Disability can also be a big barrier to employment. Obviously, the unemployment rate is much higher for folks with a disability than it is for those without a disability. And we haven't talked about this yet, so I added in the poverty rates for folks with a disability versus those without a disability, and you see the same type of disparity as you do with the unemployment rate. And education makes a big difference. It doesn't, like the slide says, it doesn't guarantee you a job if you go out and finish a bachelor's degree, for example, but only 4% of those folks in St. Paul with a bachelor's degree were unemployed at the time of this, when these data were collected, compared to 18% among those with less than a high school education. So you really improve your odds of getting a job if you have the more education that you have. And you really, by the way, decrease your chances of being in poverty with the more education that you have as well. I think that link's already been talked about somewhat today, but so jobs and skills are obviously a big part of this conversation. And some of the implications that I was seeing coming out of this data, and I'm sure this will be an ongoing conversation, but developing job opportunities in St. Paul is a central issue. And connecting people to jobs in St. Paul, connecting people in St. Paul with jobs, regardless of if they're in a different part of the city or maybe there are jobs elsewhere in Minneapolis or in the suburbs, that whole transportation issue is a big part of the issue when we're talking about ending poverty. And finally, that skill building or including formal education, of course, is a big part of addressing poverty here in the city as well. Okay, we're getting closer to lunch. A couple of other measures of economic distress. Stable housing is a challenge. 42% of households and there's more of a sort of a laundry list of other data that we've put together in this handout that you'll find in your packet, but just a few of those, that 42% of households are housing cost burden, meaning they're paying more of their income than is really sustainable for housing, putting them at risk of losing their housing. So that's a really high proportion of folks who are housing cost burdened in St. Paul. There's been over 1,200 foreclosures per year for the past several years. That might be down a little bit now in 2011, but there's been a lot of foreclosures, which has not helped at all with community stability. And in terms of homelessness, nearly 1,700 people. Of the last time Wilder Research does this homeless survey that many of you have helped us out with, and thank you very much for that. We have another one coming up in this coming October. But the last time we did that, 1,700 people were, nearly 1,700 people were identified as literally homeless. So this doesn't even include folks who might be staying on somebody's couch. This is people who are on the street or in shelters in 2009, and that was up dramatically from previous years. And I know from my work on the homeless management information system that those shelters have been full ever since this study has been done. It continues to be a crisis that's ongoing here in St. Paul. One final question to see how well your table has done before we wrap up this discussion. All St. Paul neighborhoods are experiencing about the same level of poverty. Is that too easy? Okay. I won't take the vote. I hear you. You're right. Okay, false. And so what does that look like? All of these areas that are either very dark or somewhat dark, the population in poverty is very high. And so it's not, the poverty is not spread out equally through the city. Obviously, you all already knew that. So this plays into how does Opportunity St. Paul unfold? Well, certain areas of the city will need to be targeted more than others, perhaps. And there are, I can't resist when we're looking at how, where there are clusters of poverty, that there are real implications for that. And we did a study about a year and a half ago with the Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota Foundation that showed areas, neighborhoods that have higher concentrations of poverty actually have shorter life expectancies than areas that have higher incomes or lower poverty rates. So if it isn't real enough for you just to talk about, having less money, how about having, 5 or 8 years less of your life to live? I mean, there are very real consequences of poverty here in the Twin Cities and in St. Paul. So just a quick review of what we've gone over today. We've talked about the background, age, household composition, and so on. Basic takeaways. My wife always tells me, you might have gone to school for a long time, but your real degree should be Master of the Obvious, because some of this stuff, we kind of already knew that. Hopefully the actual hard data, the numbers will come in useful, though, as this unfolds. But poverty rates have risen dramatically. Children have particularly high rates. Single-parent households have very high poverty rates. Immigrations and populations of color, unfortunately, have higher rates of poverty than the white non-Hispanic populations. Jobs and job skills are keys to ending poverty, and poverty is certainly concentrated in certain areas of St. Paul are some of the main takeaways. But please don't forget some of the specific numbers. Over how many people in poverty in St. Paul? That's how much of the population? And includes? Okay, so that gives you all something to post on Facebook, right? If you're interested in using, and just generating the conversation and keeping this initiative going. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks for your dedication to the issue.